Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our event today, Supporting Scholarly Research, Perspectives from Europe and America. We're so glad you can join us, especially with our last minute change of date. So I'm Carol Hollier and I'm on the SLA Europe Events Committee, and I'll be facilitating the event today. So now I'm going to turn to our event today, which is the Supporting Scholarly Research, Perspectives from Europe and America, and I'd like to introduce our panelists. So we have with us Claire Sewell, and Claire is the Research Support Librarian for the Physical Sciences at the University of Cambridge, and she oversees training and support for the research community across all disciplines. Claire received her MSc in Library and Information Studies from the University of, I can never say it, apologies, I'm not from the UK, Aberystwyth, I think that's wrong, in 2013. She achieved SLIP chartership in 2013 also, and has a PG cert in Teaching and Learning in Higher Education just in 2021. She is currently serving as the president-elect of SLA Europe, and she recently published her first book, The No-Nonsense Guide to Research Support and Scholarly Communication. Then we have with us Yen Tran, and Yen is the Research Impact Librarian at San Jose State University, and she has academic liaison responsibilities for biological sciences, chemistry, geology, meteorology and climate science, and physics and astronomy. She got her MLIS from the University of Washington, and her research interests are focused on libraries and high-impact educational practices and scholarly communications. Finally, we have Emily Chan with us, and she is the Associate Dean for Research and Scholarship at San Jose State University. And she got her MLIS from San Jose State University, and her research interests include scholarly communications and collections. Last July, Yen and Emily published their extensive report, Supporting Scholarly Research, Current and New Opportunities for Academic Libraries, which was a choice white paper. So now a little bit of housekeeping before we start. So you can either use the chat or the Q&A functions for your questions, and please feel free to ask them at any time during the presentations. But we will wait to answer them until both presentations have finished. So we'll have our Q&A section at the end of our session today. And so now let me hand over to Claire.
Scarily couldn't find the unmute button there for a second, which is quite amusing. I don't know if you can see my necklace, but it actually says you're on mute, which I did buy as a direct result of the pandemic. Okay, so we put my technical skills to the test. So thank you for that wonderful introduction. I always get slightly embarrassed when people read out introductions, but I should probably say it says first book published, only book, never doing that again. No, honestly, it was a wonderful experience, but it was definitely an experience. So I'm going to talk about, even though it says Europe, mainly the UK perspective, I'll be honest, because I am based in Cambridge, UK, and that's kind of where my knowledge lies, and talk a little bit about the sort of growth of scholarly communication support in academic libraries over about the last 5-6 years that I've been involved. For most of that time in a role prior to the one I have now, I specialised in teaching and training library staff in this area. So I'm going to talk more about the skills side of things, just because that's kind of where my specialism lies. Before I start, I should probably say, set some context, especially for those that aren't in the UK, but perhaps for those who are as well. But there are two sort of big influences on the rise of scholarly communication and research support in libraries in the UK specifically. There's one called the REF, the Research Excellence Framework, which I believe the current exercise was submitted today. So I'm sure there's lots of very relieved librarians up and down the country. And this is our big exercise in assessing the kind of impact and the quality, for want of a better word, of the research that's produced in UK higher education institutions. This is important because sort of all the researchers submit what they consider their best, most impactful in whatever way piece of work. and these all get sent off and get assessed. And the more reach and more impact, and I don't just mean scholarly impact, but impact in actual society, impact on policy in the real world, if you like, outside academia, that all gets assessed. The greater the rating of the research at the end, the more money is given for future research. So it's really a big deal, because it can impact all sorts of things, like a university's rankings, or even its ability to continue doing research in certain areas. So it's a big thing. The second sort of major influence is something called the Finch report, which came out in 2012. And this looked at how the results of published academic research could be better made available to the wider world, because quite a lot of this research is funded by public money. And there was the idea, obviously, that you don't want that hidden away behind a paywall. You want people to be able to access that research. So the main conclusion of the report was that open access was the way forward, and that the UK government and lots of major research funders sort of jumped on that bandwagon and started to mandate that the results of any research that they produce should be made openly available. These sort of two influences coincided with the ref previous to the one that's just gone in, so 2014, and the suggestion was that things that were submitted for the ref had to be made available open access, or they wouldn't count, essentially. So it's a really big influence on the way that research is done, the way that research is shared, and then the corresponding levels of support that were needed. So over the past few years, in response to kind of these changes and these influences, there was really this sort of sudden, if you like, accelerated need for research support for librarians to become involved in supporting researchers in their work. Because of the increased pressure of having to make something open access, there's an admin burden that comes with that. There's a lot of cultural change and philosophical reasoning about why it's a good thing that comes with that. And I think the initial reaction was a lot of higher education institutions decided they needed to do something, but they sort of added extra responsibilities on top of the roles that were already being done. So I've spoken to people who, for example, worked in IT departments who suddenly found themselves responsible for an institutional repository, cataloguers who were suddenly, or metadata specialists who were suddenly dealing with open access and adding metadata to repository records and all that kind of thing. So it was added responsibilities rather than hiring in new people. And this all sort of came at a time where there was no formal training available, or very little. So most of the people developed their skills on the job. They kind of read around what they were doing. They asked the people that they knew, but it was all kind of a kind of instant reaction to the outcomes of the Finch report and the last ref that, oh, we need to provide some support. We'll just add it on to extra people's jobs. One of the results of this really was that everyone sort of did their own thing in its own pocket. So one university would be doing things one way, another university would be doing something in a slightly different way, all working towards similar goals, but doing it slightly differently. And these kind of local workflows became very embedded in the way things were done, just as the kind of the gut reaction. However, over time, it sort of became more of a normal role that you would see in UK academic libraries. And this sort of life cycle, I think, is true of any role in a UK academic library, any role that emerges. So these institutions sort of recognised there was a need for more specialist roles, and these could be really specialist. So institutional repository manager, or open access specialist, or data manager, or something really focused on one area. Or they might be just scholarly communications librarians, scholarly communications specialists, so specialising within the discipline. A lot of the way these roles are created, I think, depends on how the institution sees scholarly communication, and therefore how it supports it. So obviously I work at the University of Cambridge. It's a very large, very complex institution. It's also quite a rich institution, at least in comparable terms with other institutions across the world. So To be frank, we have money for specialist roles that other places might not. We have money to support more of the process that other places might not. So if you think about what scholarly communication means to a particular institution, say your institution, does it start early on in the research process when the researcher is obtaining a grant to do some work? When they're actually carrying out the research, is there support provided alongside their work? Or does it only start once something has become published? So does the institution only offer support once something is accepted by a journal for publication and then admin things need to be done? So that kind of influences the roles and the specialisms that were created. Around this time, there was more sort of training available, but it tended to be kind of grassroots initiatives. So people were getting together and starting again, sort of little pockets of training here and there. Certainly when I started, I learned a lot from librarians in the US because they're further down the path than we were in the UK, or certainly at my institution. And people tried to develop their knowledge that way. So even though it was done at a local level, there was a bit more branching out. And I think that one of the good things about this community is that it talks a lot about open research and open practices. And along with that comes a willingness to share information, to share knowledge, which was really, really helpful to me when I started, and I know to colleagues who are at a similar career stage. And then I think more recently, scholarly communication has become more embedded or recognised as part of a general role in an academic library. So I very much believe that any role in an academic library has some part in the scholarly communication process. That is something that is up for debate. I know people who will violently agree and disagree with that statement, but anyone who works in an academic library helps support the research process. And I think there's been more of a recognition of that in maybe the last 2 or 3 years. There is maybe some discrepancy in where these roles are based. They're not always based within the library. So a lot of institutions, Cambridge included, has a research office. They obviously support researchers. There's people doing the training of the PhDs. So they would support researchers, the academics. And there's lots of stakeholders within the process. And this is good because it's led to more formal creation of training and knowledge exchange. And I think it's kind of part of a life cycle, because the people that started at the very first point of this evolution diagram here, they didn't have that backup and support. They had to kind of figure it out themselves. And it was based really on who they knew and like who they were friends with and who they could get information from. Whereas now it's becoming more widely recognised. There's more training events I've seen, things like I was asked to write my book, and I've seen other people writing similar books and papers on the same kind of thing. So it's becoming more and more known about and kind of more embedded in master's courses for librarianship as well. But there is still, I think, some way to go and some work to do. And one of the things that I think emphasises this is 5 years ago now, so yeah, 2016, we did some research in my department looking mainly at the educational background of people who worked back then in scholarly communication roles. And we talked about which route they come to this role by, the skills that they used. That's what it says now, because now was 5 years ago, and the skills that they thought that they would use in the future. I don't think any of the words on the screen there will be a surprise to anyone who knows anything about this area. Copyright and open access are the two sort of the big ones that come up again and again. We had, forget the exact number, but it was definitely more than 500 responses from around the world. Sadly, it was one of those, the paper never actually got formally published, but I have put a preprint, for want of a better word, and there's a link there which I can get distributed later as well, if you want to sort of see the full outcomes and what was said. And it sort of talked about the skills that they used and how they come by those skills. And I think reflecting back on the sort of evolutionary chart, a lot of the people that responded had been in those roles for a reasonable amount of time, so at least 5-6 years by the time they did the survey. They found that they were developing most of their knowledge on the job and kind of learning as they were going and kind of asking their friends and building their own networks and that kind of thing. And that's how they learned about what was going on. It would be quite interesting, I think, to repeat the exercise now, because I suspect the results would be slightly different in that people were coming to these skills through more of a formalized their education or training courses or similar. But certainly when we did it, people were saying, actually, I had little or no guidance in this. I sort of made it up as I went along, which, full confession, I did when I first started in this role. The other interesting thing to come out of this survey that we did was we asked people about their educational background. You had sort of two camps, if you like. You had people who'd come through the traditional librarianship background. They'd done their MLIS degree, and they progressed into this area of librarianship. And then you had people who'd done advanced research degrees, so PhDs and above, who'd almost sort of fallen into this area, I suppose, never thought of themselves as working in a library before, but actually found this was quite a good fit for their skill set because it was supporting people who'd been through the same process that they had. What was interesting was that the people who had done a PhD or similar actually said, you know what, I felt that prepared me more than the formal education of those that had come through the library route. They felt actually having done a research project and been through that process themselves gave them a level of insight, which I can appreciate, because until I had done any formal research, I didn't quite understand how tricky the process was and maybe sort of dismissed things that I shouldn't have done. One thing that particularly stands out for the UK context here is that even working in an academic library, doing formal research is not, for most people, part of their role. It's an additional thing that you choose to do. It's usually very much outside your paid hours, which is a barrier if you've got caring responsibilities or you like sleep or something like that. It's an extra thing that you have to do in your own time. So that does kind of make me wonder a little bit if people who've been through the research process are saying, actually, we feel better equipped to do these jobs. Is this then a barrier then for librarians? What does that sort of mean? And that's a question that I'm going to throw out there to the discussion. I don't have all of the answers for that. I have a kind of interpretation of what I might say the answers are. One thing that I talk about quite a lot, because I have that emphasis on skills and education in this area, I speak to a lot of librarians at all career stages who sort of see this as an up-and-coming area and want to get involved. And they all sort of say to me, well, I don't know what open access is. I don't know about data management. I'm not really sure about publishing. I've never done any formal research. So I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not going to get a role in this area. And I think there's sort of four key things that I draw their attention to, somewhat linked to the research that we did. And I apologize, I hate the terms hard and soft skills, but they do sort of fit here. So the first one is the subject knowledge. So things like knowing what open access is, knowing about data management policies, the kind of the core subject specific knowledge that you need to know. And I think this can quite easily be learnt by a lot of people. If you think about people who work in most areas of the information profession, certainly within academic libraries, a lot of them have not got a formal qualification in the area they end up supporting. I look after researchers in physical sciences, so that's maths, physics, chemistry, astronomy, basically everything I was terrible at all the way through school. I now support researchers. They talk to me sometimes about their research. I have no clue what their research actually entails. So don't be too hung up on the core knowledge. You can learn that, and that's reasonably easy to do. And then you've got these hard and soft skills. So that the hard skills are sort of the things, the skill set you'll see specified for a role. So it might be you need a certain level of technical skill. It might be that you need management skills in some way, or a language that you need to speak. And I think with a bit of effort, most people can also learn those, or at least learn enough to get by in their job. So I wouldn't let that sort of side of things put you off. On the right hand side of the diagram there, you've got the soft skills, so things like communication, interpersonal skills, critical thinking, ability to sort of think on your feet. That again can be learned, but I would say that's a little bit harder to learn. It's something you sort of, you have or you don't have, and you can maybe develop it, but not everyone really. If you're not good at communication, there's only so far you can go in developing that skill. But it is still quite important to think about those kind of things that you can do. And then the big one really is the personal attributes. So I think to work in scholarly communication and research support, you do need to be a certain type of person. So you need to be quite resilient. One of my favourite answers from the survey that we did, we asked people what skills they needed. Someone said gumption, which I think sums it up. So you need to be quite ready to sort of get in there and dig your heels in and be a bit persistent with people who might not quite be open to the culture change that you're trying to bring in. You get a lot of people disagreeing with you, and you'll get a lot of things that change all the time. I've been known to go and leave work on a Friday and the funder policy says one thing, and you come in on a Monday morning and the funder policy says something else. So you have to change everything, and you have to be quite comfortable with that. You have to let go of being a perfectionist, because in the time you spent perfecting whatever it is, the thing that you're trying to educate someone on or help them with has changed. So that part of the job description, I think, is something that people don't ignore, but don't always give due consideration. And I would argue that in this area, it's one of the most important things, because everything else you can learn, but you have to be the person who doesn't take things personally. You have to be the one who can dig your heels in. You have to have gumption, and that's kind of something that you either have or you don't have. So in the sort of conclusion to that bit, what I would say is this is my personal opinion, I think, on what you need to work in this area. And I think this is a lot of the skills that you might recognize. They might not be called this in the job adverts and the job descriptions for these particular roles, but if you actually drill down to what they really want, this is the kind of thing. So you need to be adaptable. You can't be that person who thrives on consistency. You need to be able to kind of think on your feet and change your approach and do something differently, even if you've been doing it the same way for ages, because everything is so fast in this area, such a high turnover, that you just need to be able to adapt to different things. You need to be able to communicate effectively, and I don't just mean stand up and do public speaking, although that is an important component. But a lot of these areas are very complex and complicated. And some researchers, and I can completely understand why, are not maybe as invested in the entire history of the open access movement as you might be. They just want to know which bit of the form they have to fill in to get their article published. So you need to be able to tell someone the right thing at the right time when they need to know it, and not sort of go off on a tangent, a skill I have obviously yet to develop. You do need to be quite persistent, because it's changing some very long established practices, I think, and you're going to meet a lot of resistance in that. So you need to be able to keep going back to the table and talking to people who will argue with you. And you need to be able to perform really fast under pressure and find information really quickly, because researchers are no different to 99% of library users, especially those in academic library. They will come to you an hour before their thing is due in and tell you that they need, I don't know about copyright for my article, which box should I have ticked? Or what is open access anyway? Should I maybe know about that? They're asking me for money, what should I do? You need to be able to respond to that quickly. And it's not about knowing everything, but it's about knowing where to find the answers to all those questions. You need to do it quite quickly. And it probably won't come as any surprise, the big reveal here is that I think that all of those skills we've listed actually sums up a librarian or an information professional. But I don't think we always make that connection when we're looking at roles in this sector. But I would say that these are kind of the things that have become really important, certainly in the UK, and certainly in the ability to get roles in this area and thrive in them. is being this sort of type of person, I think it is a really, really good fit for the Info Pro skill set. So just to sort of finish, a couple of questions that occurred to me when I was prepping this slide deck is that perhaps as librarians, we should stop seeing ourselves so much as supporting research, but as partners in research. So, and at all levels and across the institution or across anywhere that supports research, is we are offering support, but are we more partners in that process than something other? And then thinking of the new skills, so should we flip it on its head and instead of listing all these things that we could know about, actually make the best use of what we do know and how we know to do things? That was just a couple of questions that I wanted to leave you with. But now I'm going to hand over to Emily, I believe.
Great introduction to what Yen and I will cover in terms of supporting scholarly research, current and new opportunities for academic libraries, a perspective from the US and Canada. And thank you to Carol for the lovely introduction. So a little bit about us. I'll go ahead and let Yen go first.
Sure. I mean, Carol already introduced us, but I am the research impact librarian here at San Jose State in California, and my contact information is there. So if you have any further questions, please feel free to get in touch with me.
Great. And I'm Emily Chan. Again, my contact information is listed, and I'm happy to have further conversations after this session. So
I was just going to say that we're really glad to be here today with you from the West Coast in California, where it's the morning. Today, we are going to share how academic libraries in the US and Canada have been supporting faculty or supporting scholarly research. We'll talk a little bit about the white paper that we produced for choice, and then we'll discuss some new developments and implications since the publication of our white paper was about a year ago. So Emily's going to talk to you a little bit about the methodology, and I'll put a link to the white paper in the chat for everybody.
Great, thank you. And as Yen mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about the paper first. So it was commissioned by Choice, which is a publishing unit of the Association of College and Research Libraries, a division of the American Library Association. It was underwritten by ProQuest. In this paper, we were going to look at some of the developments within scholarly research, looking to see what kinds of opportunities there were for academic librarians and academic libraries. So we used a mixed methods approach. Not only did we issue a survey to gather some quantitative data, we held 11 interviews to acquire some qualitative information. As you can see, the survey was distributed from April 8th, and it closed on May 4th, and the interviews were conducted between April 23rd and May 11th in 2020. So of that, we were able to gather 196 viable responses, and we conducted 11 interviews. And they really helped to kind of give us a sense of what different libraries were doing in terms of their approach to scholarly research. As you can see from the dates that the data collection did overlap with the initial months of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we did receive fewer than what we had expected in terms of survey responses. However, having the additional interviews helped to kind of flesh out some of the quantitative data that we were able to glean. And it should be noted for the interviews, we did have a mix of institutions, 2 special libraries, 4 master's level, and 5 research-focused institutions. So that was really important to see the breadth of how different institutions were supporting scholarly research. Within our paper, we were looking at 4 areas of research focus, and you can see those items here listed. We have these in rank order, but the 4 areas of focus include things like publishing and dissemination support. So examples of these would include things like the provision of institutional repositories, assisting faculty with the identification of appropriate journals for publication, advocacy of authors' rights. Another area, research impact metrics or discovery support. Examples of these could include things like providing resources and training on quantitative measures for citation metrics, or individual researcher metrics, things like, impact factor, things like that. The next area of focus that we were focusing upon was research data management. And of course, examples of these could include things like creation of data management plans. And last but not least, the area of focus for identifying, tracking, and managing funding support. This encompassed activities like the provision of funding databases, like Pivot or Spin, providing training on their use and their application. So within our survey, we asked survey respondents to rank their library's emphases and the commitments to each of these 4 areas of support. And thinking about those emphases within the context of offerings, including these 6 areas, things like database subscriptions, support through the creation of online or research guides, the provision of trainings, research, workshops, or instruction in support of that focus area, individual consultations, potentially software technology, and physical space. So we had, not only did we have survey respondents look at these 4 areas, they contextualize how much their libraries were providing providing support within each of those areas. And so that was really important, because what we wanted to really suss out from this line of inquiry was, how have academic libraries' responses to the changing nature of faculty research, particularly as it relates to research funding, data management, publishing and dissemination, and impact and metrics, how has that manifest itself? And what are some of the emerging supports and new directions for libraries as they look to support research funding, data management, publishing, dissemination, and impact and metrics? So how have they been doing it? What do they think are some of the new directions and future directions as they continue to support these areas? Provide remote control to Yen, who's going to talk a little bit more about some of the other things that we found in our study.
So, one of the recurring themes that we saw in our study was that in response to changing faculty research needs in terms of, resources, spaces, and staffing, academic libraries were really leveraging partnerships in order to fulfill these needs, especially in the US. We have very tight budgets or even stagnant budgets. And so these partnerships are both internal and external partnerships. So internally, libraries were collaborating extensively with their offices of research, the different schools or colleges within their institution, and then also most frequently with individual faculty. These collaborations really ensured strong relationships in providing more resources. So things like databases were most common, as well as promotion and outreach of those different resources, and then also promoting the use of those different resources as part of this sort of group of people who are supporting faculty research on campus. Libraries were also leveraging external partnerships. So they were creatively sort of meeting budgets or staffing challenges through consortial relationships. So the consortial memberships can provide access to content and also potentially relieve some staffing shortages. So similar to sort of those internal collaborations. The partnerships also really allowed for the ability to scale significant technological platforms. So either the institutional repository or the ILS with potential dedicated staffing for each of those different aspects. Another theme that we saw from our study was that with flat or shrinking budgets, many academic libraries have been unable to grow their staff or had to look critically at any of the positions that became available or became vacant. And so for those who were able to hire, each new vacancy was really scrutinized to bring it in alignment with the library's needs, whatever it is that they need to provide to be able to support faculty research on their campuses. However, the majority of people we heard from were really unable to hire new staff and therefore had to alter existing staff responsibilities in order to align with current needs of the library, to meet with new researcher or campus requests, or to plan for the future. So similar to a lot of what Claire was talking about earlier. So essentially, library staff continued providing their traditional supports while also taking on additional aspects of are aligned with their skills or knowledge or their interests. So by being asked to be a liaison as well as provide data support services, for example, libraries really will need to focus on professional growth and development of the individual in order to be successful in offering new faculty research support. So that professional development piece is really important. And so even though new roles or responsibilities are arising for individual librarians, we found that liaison or subject librarians continue to be really central to faculty research support, as they are the ones that really do provide the bulk of the staffing and often support faculty on this one-to-one basis. So therefore, the role of liaison or subject librarians really cannot be overlooked in establishing or increasing research and scholarship support for faculty. So as I said, our white paper was published about a year ago at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. And as Emily mentioned, we collected our data within the first few weeks of the pandemic. And so at that time, we were really unsure of its impacts on faculty research and library support of faculty research. So after living in the pandemic for the last year, here are some of the potential impacts that we have observed in the US, and these may also apply to Canada as well. So one thing that we saw was the professional development, right? So professional development has changed significantly with greater online availability of things like webinars or trainings or workshops like the one today here. These will most likely continue. However, the role of conferences or meetings have played in providing a space to meet, network, build relationships for collaborations has not been filled well by virtual meetings. And this really could potentially impact the dissemination, especially of scholarly work by and also potentially impacting, research metrics as well in terms of faculty being able to present their research. Another thing that we've noticed is that budgets will continue to be really uncertain. So while there are monies allocated to institutions of higher education by the federal and state governments here in the US, we are seeing differences in the disbursement of funds for two-year community colleges as compared to four-year colleges or universities. And so these will also likely be highly variable as well in libraries' acquisitions or receipt of these additional funds, making it even harder for libraries to provide new faculty research support services. Another item that we're seeing that faculty research has significantly been altered in many ways, both potentially some things like we've seen a noted rise in submitted manuscripts as faculty researchers turned their attention to completing past projects and the potential of a dearth of bench science research in the next couple of years as those really continue to resume and pick up again. Another sort of significant change that we've seen is just disparities across not only disciplines, but career stages, as well as across genders, right? So humanities scholars have been impacted by sort of the closures of libraries, archives, and museums, because those are the types of materials that they work with when they conduct research. Junior faculty from all disciplines, are stopping their tenure clocks, especially scholars who maybe have children or who are caretakers. And so gender is really being impacted, as well as, those who are in their early careers. We do also wonder about remote work and if it could help to mitigate some of the staffing challenges, as well as the virtualization of a lot of resources and services, right? So if you're able to hire from anywhere, we might be able to hire folks to fulfill some of the roles that are missing or that we need. And then lastly, with the potential of more research being virtualized or maybe available through non-traditional ways, such as the increase in preprints and the use of preprint databases, there may be a move beyond traditional research inputs and outputs and metrics. So libraries may be asked to play a larger role in all of those aspects, including the prominence of IRs as well as metrics support. So lastly, for me here, we wanted to talk about a few of the most recent developments that we've been seeing in the US in terms of its impact on research support. And so one of those items is an emphasis on equity, diversity, and inclusion. So the last few years has brought to the surface in the United States, especially that, racism and inequities persist and continue to exist. And so as US scholars, researchers, and libraries try to address the issues of EDI, or equity, diversity, inclusion, we are really interested in seeing its impact on, on library practices, resources, and services, especially the integration of EDI into all of those different aspects of library work. We're interested in seeing how, as a topic of research, right? So as more integrate or pivot their research, emphasize EDIs that impact faculty research. And then on grant funding opportunities in the US, right, funding is attained through a very decentralized system, and each entity can determine who and what topics receive grant funding. And so we're curious to see how EDI funding, how the distribution of funding can be increased for EDI topics. And then most recently, just March 16th here, there was an open access agreement between the University of California system and the publisher of Elsevier, right? So this transformative agreement makes all University of California research available, open access to people worldwide. So it's available to them immediately and at no cost. And this agreement is really significant because the UC system as a whole, it's only 10 universities out of hundreds in the US. The UC as a whole generates nearly 10% of all US research output. And Elsevier disseminates about 17% of journal articles produced by UC faculty. And so we're seeing this and we're wondering, what sort of impact this has and what sort of impact future agreements between major publishers and universities could have on all of the aspects that we looked at in our white paper. So publishing and dissemination, open access, research metrics, and really how libraries can support all of these different aspects. So I'm going to throw it back to Emily, who's going to talk a little bit about sort of some of the new opportunities in this new normal.
Thank you, Yen. One of the elements, so looking at those four areas of focus, publishing and dissemination support, we're thinking about what could be some of the impacts from some of the most recent developments. When considering things like transformative agreements, the University of California, they're publishing their contract with Elsevier. It's going to be a point now that people will be able to look at that contract and move a little bit further, right, in terms of implementing a transformative agreement on their own particular campus or for their system. And so in terms of thinking about the institutional repository, there's been a lot of focus on providing faculty publications, maybe in pre or post prints. If the version of record is going to be available for free through these transformative agreements, that will allow a lot of room for IR managers and individuals who outreach for IRs to really focus on local content and to focus on student work as opposed to trying to acquire faculty publications. And as a result of this, I think we think there's going to be a lot more guidance possibly on things like tech transfer as well as intellectual property. I think there's going to be a lot of discussion about those areas. For the transformative agreement for the UC, it's an opt-out agreement. So everyone is automatically going to have their work available open access unless they choose to opt out of the system. So that's a huge shift. Secondly, when you look at things like research impact, metrics, or discovery support, this is a huge area of growth for libraries, thinking about what could be some of the ways in which we begin to contextualize what might be the impact from research. Given what the fact that we've successfully and virtualized so many of our services, how do some of those kind of impact the metrics that are being collected? And I think more than anything else, it emphasizes how important it is for things that we do make available to be discoverable, right? So things like metadata description, all of that is going to really be helpful in terms of finding these important works. Research data management, sharing and preservation support, again, that's going to be another area of emphasis. There's a huge push for virtualization and for having things digitized. So this will continue along that front. And in thinking about funding support, identifying, tracking, and managing funding support, there's a lot of potential here as well, considering how EDI initiatives, equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives will intersect with new areas of research and initiatives to support EDI topics. So this will be important. And in thinking about some of the opportunities for networking, thinking how can we collaborate, find collaborators in these areas when there's less in-person opportunities. How do we improve collaboration and networking opportunities in a virtualized setting? Those are other areas of import. And going back to what Claire had said, I think librarians are excellent connectors, and that is really an area that I think is very important for us to kind of focus on too. How can the library connect faculty researchers to internal supports like the Office of Research, things like that, as well as externally to data repositories, all of these other subject discipline supports that may be available. So there's, I think, a lot of opportunity and growth for libraries in this, and I can't emphasize enough how important it is to just be adaptable and to have an open mind frame about how all of this affects our current and future work. Yen and I assembled a very short list of further readings. These kind of speak to some of the elements that we had talked about. Things like the impact of COVID on academic authors and the disproportionate impacts that they've had based off of things like discipline, gender, where one's at in their career. But these would be really excellent things to further read if one's interested in this topic. And that concludes our section.
Don't apologize. It was really interesting. I do have a question here, which might be to Emily and Yen, although Claire, feel free to speak up too if you have something to add. Actually, it's probably for everybody. Are subject librarians being traded for research support posts? So I would assume that in the US, it would be like as subject librarians are retiring or something. But I wonder what you think.
This is Emily. I would say that what we're hoping, what we've seen, and even our own institution, we are still hiring within a subject librarian framework, but we're seeing where does that subject librarian, where are their natural supports within the research life cycle, right? So if someone is being hired for, say, a humanities position, I would hope that there would be some of those hard skills that Claire talked about, which include things like digital humanities skills, text mining, having some awareness of some of the evolving research needs within that area.
Okay, I was just going to read out the next question, which we got. It's an American living in the UK, so that's like me. And we don't have many research impact librarians in the UK. And she says, correct me if I'm wrong. Do research impact managers also work on moving away from using impact factors and citation metrics and more towards a DORA kind of principles? And then she asked, is this a role for librarians?
I think it's definitely, well, certainly from the UK, I think it's maybe not something that we have many specialist roles in, certainly not within Cambridge, although within Cambridge, I think we are moving more that way. It's a recognised field, and DORA, for people who don't know, is I can never remember what it stands for. It's basically, it's a document that says you shouldn't rely completely on numbers when measuring impacts and things like that. And I think there's, getting back to the US perspective, it's that connection again. So it's the librarian's knowledge of kind of all the different areas and the different people and how they can bring those together. I think it's definitely a evolving area in the UK, but I will turn it over to the US perspective because I suspect that that's what the question is asking.
Yeah, this is Yen. I would say that it is an evolving. It's an evolving role. I think that bibliometrics, or sort of the traditional metrics, is still very important for faculty and for also looking to embrace those alternative metrics, as well as social and cultural metrics. So kind of the incorporation of research into different policies or maybe different practices, maybe even looking at, page views or download views, as opposed to really looking at the number of citations. So I think it is really evolving, and I think some of it is based on the faculty and what is it that they need based on maybe their disciplines, but also the university and what is it that what sort of story are they trying to tell in terms of funders, and in terms of donors and other people where they might be trying to gather some funds for research.
So, and I'll add that I do believe that more and more UK universities are becoming DORA signatories. So they're embracing the principles. So we got another question here. Besides institutional repositories, are you seeing an evolution in the library's role towards library publishing, i.e. the library acting as a publisher of journals and monographs?
That's a good question. We didn't specifically ask that within the white paper, though I think there are a lot of like foundational costs and staffing that needs to support that. If a library wanted to become more of a publisher and to use maybe an institutional repository as a publishing platform, that requires a lot of staffing outlay, which I think given everything else right now that libraries are trying to do, it's certainly one of those things that can help kind of further, I guess, have further discussions about that would be rich. I guess there are so many good publishers right now that are trying different models. I don't know if libraries would want to take on that responsibility. Rather, there are publishers like the University of California Press. They have their own open access arm, or they use Luminos as a way to produce scholarship, monograph scholarship in an open access manner. And so I think other established publishers are going this route, and I don't think that libraries necessarily need to go in that way. But that being said, we did not ask that within our white paper.
We've seen a steady trickle, I suppose, over the last few years. Pockets of researchers will come out and approach us about the possibility of using the repository to publish. It tends to be those who are quite interested in open research anyway, and just naturally gravitate towards the library, or the library is the place to ask that question. But I agree, it's very labour intensive, and Cambridge is lucky that it has someone who specifically looks after the repository, and that is their job. But that's, not everywhere has the manpower, woman power, or person power to devote to that area. So I think it will be a trend in the future, and I'm interested to see where it goes.
For San Jose State, we do have like 6 open access journals, but those are, the editorial board, the editor-in-chief does a lot of the work themselves. So while I wouldn't necessarily say that the library is providing much beyond the platform. We are entering a little bit in the realm of open educational resources like open textbooks, but that is a very that again is kind of in its infancy and relates more to, in some cases, some out-of-print books where rights have reverted back to the author, and now they're going to just digitize the book and put it open access. There are other cases in which someone has, wants to make a textbook freely available to students, but those are more opportunities that we're helping to fulfill through the institutional repository, as opposed to us outreaching and saying, this is what we can do for you, and we want to be a publisher in this realm. It's more like using the institutional repository as a solution for an existing problem.
Okay, I'm going to wind it up with one last question that we actually got before the session. I realize we're running over a little bit, but this question is, what do you feel are the biggest challenges relating to open access books? So it connects to the previous question quite well, particularly when it comes to encouraging academics to embrace this route to publication. So probably monographs they're talking about with this.
I think certainly from my perspective, and it ties into some of the things we were talking about metrics and impact, it's the prestige of having something published formally by a certain publisher who is well known in the field. We see it more so with arts and humanities academics because they tend to publish more monographs. But I think it's getting people to embrace the idea of open educational resources and sharing more widely, and that just because it's not formally published doesn't mean it's not as good, if that makes sense. I think that's going to be a big challenge.
I wonder too if the pandemic actually might be a nice push towards this, as people really appreciate the value of, you know, even digitized monographs. People who before would have been hardcore like print book fans.
I think so. I think I've got to be careful how I phrase it, because I don't want to say anything good has come out of the last year at all. But the example that I always used to give when talking to somewhat skeptical people about open access at all in general was the Ebola outbreak in Africa, however many years ago that was. Rather tragically, it turned out there was research behind a paywall, so people couldn't actually access it, that would have helped develop drugs quicker, that would have helped treatments become available, but the people on the ground dealing with it couldn't actually access it because they weren't in an academic library. And that argument about how it actually affects people's lives tends to help sway people, but still we're talking about something that happened to other people, and now COVID has happened in some degree to everybody, and you will have been affected, whether that's accessing resources in a library or just wanting to read up on something or seeing the speed at which vaccines have been produced, whatever it is. I think that does have a real world impact, which shows the benefits of this kind of open movement to everybody.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I don't know if I've dealt with open access monographs so much as more open access, articles and shorter pieces. So whenever faculty ask me to help them sort of identify journals to publish in, that's definitely one of the questions that I ask them is, what are their priorities and what are their desires? So if they are hoping to be promoted or receive tenure, right, they probably would want something that is more that's not open access, even though open access could be a possibility. So I think it's really just a reference interview and asking what sort of outcomes or what sort of desires and requirements they have for publishing. So talking about all of those different options, and if it ends up being that open access is the route for them, then I think they would see that potentially through this reference interview.
Well, we have run over a bit, so I will wind this up, but I want to thank you so very much, all of you, for your fascinating presentations and really interesting discussion as well at the end. I do appreciate it, and I look forward to continuing this conversation somehow or other. So thanks everyone so much for coming, and I hope that that you all have a good day or evening. Thank you.